Dr. Balázs Szigeti, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you about the placebo effect. Let's get a definition on the table of what that actually is before we launch into unpacking it, whether or not it can be considered the same as fate. Yeah, like whether there's a deeper meaning to it than maybe what the public who don't do science might think. So yeah, what is the placebo effect?
So there's not like a single unified definition of it, but the one that I think most people would go by, it is that is the effect that are associated with an expectation of a benefit. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing, that you are doing something where you're expecting something good to happen, and lo and behold, it is going to happen. And the same is also happening with the negative effects. The evil brother of placebo effects are called the nocebo effects, which are sort of like the negative side of the same coin, that where you are telling patients that certain side effects are going to happen with the drug. Those side effects are going to happen, even though if it is not really caused physiologically by the drug itself. When it comes to the fakeness of the placebo effect, there is a lot of a negative connotation around placebo effect that is just like a mind trick, and it's not a real effect. So there is a biological basis to the placebo effect. It's not just kind of like a psychological effect. There is a real biological basis to it, but how exactly that's work and the nuances of that, I would say that's very much research in progress.
Okay, can you say anything more about that the biological mechanism of the placebo effect?
So the reason why this is a complicated topic is because the placebo effect works in different contexts. So for example, I mentioned pain in the last, I just mentioned pain, but that's one area where the placebo effect is working. But that is a different mechanism, for example, when we are using the placebo effect, let's say, in depression studies. And it's not about pain, then it is about mood. Or the same with anxiety disorders and OCD. In all of these disorders, we are observing placebo effects, but these conditions have a different biological basis. Yet, we are observing a placebo response in all of these conditions. Again, there is an element of a learning effect there with the placebo effect, that in your past you went and visited and saw somebody in a white coat, and many times you felt better after it. It's a learned response. You learn that seeing people in white coat and when they are prescribing you something is going to make you feel better. There's an element of learning with the placebo effect. And the placebo response is this broader effect that is everything that is happening in the placebo arms. And when it comes to placebo effects and the placebo response, it is two different things. And in the clinical trials, we mostly care about the placebo response that contains all of the changes that are happening.
So you have the placebo effect, and which is different from the placebo response, but the placebo effect can be part of the placebo response?
Correct.
Are that good? So, yeah, okay, cool. And then is that the biological thing, or just the expectation, the mind thing?
You could phrase it that way. As I said, it is not there's not a lot of research in this area, so it's hard to say whether that is the biological effect. And as I said, there is not a universally accepted definition of what is the placebo effect and what are the placebo mechanisms. So that's why it is difficult to answer this. But that's one way to phrase it, is that if there is a biological mechanism, that could be, you could identify it as the mechanisms of placebo and label it as the placebo effect, and the placebo response is everything else. But again, this is somewhat of a gray zone in the research, because this is not something that is very well studied, which is weird to me, because in a strange sense, the placebo effect is the most well studied condition, or the most studied intervention in medicine, because most trials have a placebo control condition. So we are having a lot of data on it. There is strangely little research on the placebo response in itself. The placebo response is always there. That's what we are evaluating our drugs against. Yet we don't really study what is going on in the placebo arms in these trials.
Yeah, that's wild to me, because it feels like there's so much in that we could discover, not just the, how we design better clinical trials for drugs, but also that it kind of it represents this really big unknown in medicine about the mind-body connection. I know you said that there is a biological piece to the placebo effect, but also when you mentioned about walking in to see the doctor and then they're in a white coat and they give you some sort of answer to a problem that you haven't been able to solve by yourself, that in and of itself has an effect on you, because when you feel better about not being so alone in whatever you're struggling with. That is also part of that placebo response. At least maybe I'm coming at this from a biased perspective, because I'm really interested in the idea that your mind can influence matter. Sounds to me like that's really kind of like an underlying question of how this placebo thing works. Is that fair to say?
When you're running a clinical study, like you're a medical doctor and you have a drug that you believe it's working, you're testing it in these placebo-controlled trials, and you need to show that you're better than placebo. So kind of like the placebo is the enemy. You need to show that we are better than it. There's like this negative association with it. And I think, right now, because of I'm sure we're going to talk about psychedelics in a second, but the issue with psychedelic medicine, of course, is that you can't really run those studies in a blinded manner. And blinded is the medical term that you don't know what you are taking. So, the double blind in the double blind placebo control studies means is that neither the patient nor the trial staff knows what drug is going to be administered. And if there's a drug that has very strong subjective drug effects, then this model breaks down. And with psychedelics, it's pretty easy to distinguish, let's say, 200 micrograms of LSD from placebo. That's why, you can't really run blinded studies with it. So this opened up these questions of that if you can't do these studies in a blinded manner, then what is the role really of the placebo effect? When we are treating actual patients, in a real life, in a setting, then the placebo effect is your ally. If you're a good doctor, you are going to try to lean into the placebo response and elicit the biggest possible placebo response. What we should actually study is how to maximize the placebo response. Because typically what drug companies are doing, they are trying to minimize the placebo response, which makes sense from their perspective, because what the regulators want them to show that their drug is better than the placebo response. So therefore, it is in their best interest to minimize the placebo. Drug companies have spent a lot of money in figuring out how to lower the placebo response. They have these personality questionnaires, and they are screening out the placebo responders from a study. And then therefore, when you're running a clinical trial, sometimes what they do is that they administer this personality test, or there's some other tricks that people can do, and they are screening them out, therefore lowering the placebo response, therefore making it easier for the drug to be better than the placebo response. And what you want to do in real life is exactly the opposite. You want to lean into it, and you want to maximize the placebo response, not minimize it.
Wow, that sounds so dodgy. That they would be, that the scientists, or I don't know, researchers, would be screening out people that would be more likely to respond to a placebo to show that the drug had a greater effect, so that the drug could get funded and then a pharmaceutical company could make money off the drug. That's just blows my mind. What I'm interested to know, though, what kind of personality is more susceptible to the placebo response?
So, suggestibility and, kind of absorption, those are the two big traits that are coming up over and over again. A lot of this research is done in the private sector. So, of course, they're not sharing their trade secrets. But I would say, suggestibility and absorption, those are the two big ones that is kind of out there in the literature. But, as a lot of these things nowadays, a lot of the way that these are developed is that they are just throwing a lot of questions at people, and then use some sort of machine learning algorithm to figure out what combination of responses to those questions is predictive to placebo response. And I would and I need to say that, at this point is that these predictive algorithms, how good they are, it is not they're better than random, that's for sure, but they're not very good either. Even though we have thrown a lot of resources at this problem, but we're not very good at screening out who are going to be placebo responders. It is the same with who is going to respond to medications. And in particular, psychiatry has a really bad track record of figuring out who is going to respond to what drug. So for example, with traditional antidepressants, that they have been around for decades at this point, we have spent I don't know how many millions of dollars in finding biological signatures of who is going to respond to this SSRI versus that SSRI. And there's nothing that we're really using in practice. There is this whole movement of biological psychiatry, but in reality, in real life practice, we are not using any of this research in kind of real world treatment. It never happens that, let's say I have depression, and then my psychiatrist sends me to a brain scan or an EEG, whatever, And based on that, they are going to prescribe me a different medication. And we have spent a lot of money in trying to make this work, both with the placebo response and both with the drugs, who is going to respond to which. Again, there's a lot more research on who is going to respond to drugs, but there's nothing that has been consistent. Like typically the way it goes is that you run a study and then you are going to find some biological signature in the sample in which you have tested it. But as soon as you test it in another population, in another trial, like that's, the signal is gone. And there's like a gazillion of papers about, hey, we find a biological signature of responding to a drug based on whatever biomarker.
So how are we, what is the best way to design drug trials to actually figure out what works?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And a lot of people are thinking about this at this point. I would like to go back to a little bit to what we talked about before, and that is like the screening out of placebo responders. And you said, I think that, that sounds dodgy. And it is dodgy, but here is the reason why people are allowing it. Because, for example, if you're running a cardiovascular trial, like some blood pressure medication, yes, there is a placebo response. But the gap between the typical placebo response and the drug response is much smaller in psychiatry than with other areas of medicine, and that is because there is this that the outcomes are subjective. We are in this weird position where what we are doing, I think many people are recognize that it's clearly not working. But on the other hand, we can't just say that, oopsie, we were wrong, and this past 60 years of research, it is kind of invalid. And I think that would be totally overblown. But there will be an admission of guilt that we have been running placebo-controlled research for decades, and actually maybe it's not the best idea.
Yeah, it's a real battle of the egos kind of thing of how do we maintain the fact that we have actually found out some really important things that have moved the needle in medicine, whilst also admitting that maybe we didn't find out about them in the most efficacious way.
One thing that I think it's important to recognize here is that when you are going to a doctor with whatever medical condition, you typically have two questions. And one of them is that, am I better off waiting for this condition just to get better on its own? Or should I take medication A? That's your first question. And the second question is that, should I take medication A over medication B? Am I better off taking this drug, not knowing whether I take the drug or placebo, relative to taking placebo, not knowing whether I take the drug or the placebo? That is what the placebo-controlled research answers. And I think it is clearly scientifically an important question that hey, is your treatment better than placebo? Is it something that genuinely provides more than what is possible to do without the administration of the active drug component? But this is not a patient-facing question. This is something that is interesting to me, somebody who's in science and who's a data geek, and I don't want to undermine that. But we need to recognize that patients are not interested in this question. I have never seen a patient who has got better from the placebo response and they complained about it. Typically, patients don't care about whether their back pain has been healed by a placebo response or an active drug. They are just happy that there's no back pain anymore.
I'm sure that people would like the option of not having to take a drug because drugs have side effects.
I think most people would actually still prefer to take the drug because that's the real thing. That's what kind of how we've been kind of brought up. I understand your point about the side effect, but my subjective feeling is that most people would still prefer to do the active drug, even though there are side effects. But then there is this. Then there's kind of a real drug effect. It's doing something. It cannot be fixed. This mind-body division that I think that's how most people are still operating. I think this is something that I've been arguing for in the literature and whenever I talk publicly, that instead of placebo-controlled research, maybe we should switch to waitlist-controlled research. The effect, the response in these waitlist-controlled trials is going to be less than the placebo response. You're controlling for less things that is going on, but it is much cheaper to do. And also it is going to answer a question which is relevant to patients. And if medicine is about helping patients, then we should try to answer questions that are relevant to them. The whole placebo control thing, that is something that is for scientists and regulators, and I don't want to dismiss that. But I do feel that we should also increase the patient-centricness I'm not sure if that's the word, but I think you know what I mean, the patient-centricness of medical research.
Okay, so just so I'm clear on what the waitlist control is it kind of like a similar thing to like you are figuring out if there is a placebo, quote unquote, response to people knowing that they are on a wait list for a drug? Is
Yeah, it's
that
kind of
kind
like
of what
help
it
is on the
is?
way. Help is on the
Help is on the
way.
way.
Help
But
is on the
wouldn't
way, and the other part is that like it's just like this regression to the mean effect, because it is well known, which I said earlier, that most people sign up for clinical trials where their symptoms are the worst. So it controls for like some of that positive expectation effect that like help is on the way, and it controls for just this like, hey, like just life is just like happens. It's sometimes up, sometimes down, and it controls for those things.
when I hear that, I think, well, would that necessarily be appropriate for all medical conditions across the board? Are we still talking about just within the realm of psychiatric and mental health conditions? Because for some people, um, on clinical trials, that they're at the point where they probably don't have any time.
Most of these tools that I shared about like, trials, they are applicable to psychiatric trials and mental health research. Like let's just say that, because like, that's broader than psychiatry. And really, again, the distinguishing feature is that in other areas of medicine, you can actually beat the placebo response. But it turns out that in mental health research, it's very, very difficult. So that's why it requires that kind of like special treatment within medicine. And the other point, which I think is important to point out, and this is this whole issue that psychedelics have opened up, that typically for mental health drugs, like, whether we are talking about like, some benzos or traditional antidepressants, they have very strong subjective effects. We're trying to help a subjective condition in mental health by definition, and therefore a lot of these drugs have this very noticeable effect. And what that means is that if let's say you're enrolled in a placebo-controlled trial, and then I'm giving you the drug, but of course I don't tell you whether it's placebo or the real thing. But from the side effects of the drugs, like it's often pretty easy to figure it out. And psychedelics are the poster boy for this problem. And the technical term for this is functional unblinding. So as I said, blinding is that you don't know what you're taking, and then functional blinding is that even though we, the research team, have not told you what you're getting, but functionally you gain that knowledge just through the experience of going through the trial.
So what do we do? What's a better way to research psychedelic medicine if not placebo-controlled double-blind?
So I think, so the one thing which is important to say here is that like the regulators, like the FDA, at this point, it looks like that they are happy to play this game. Like, I do not see that there is any like movement from the regulators to change how things are going to be done.
So you have a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which is the gold standard in medical research, including psychiatric and mental health research, and that is where you're giving the participants of the trial and then also the researchers of the trial don't know who is getting the placebo and who is getting the pharmacological intervention. And you were saying previously that in any sort of clinical trial that is testing subjective experience, that the placebo effect is always going to be larger because people have that hope, that expectation, that kind of that suggestibility, or I guess like the suggestibility. Why is this a major or becoming more of a problem now that we're getting into psychedelic research? Because the placebo is harder to ignore, or just, can you catch me up to speed on that bit?
The issue is the functional unblinding, that even when we are not telling patients what drug they are getting, it's just super easy to figure it out.
Even with a microdose?
Even with microdosing, yes. Like, again, like it's going to have like a dose-response relationship. The smaller the dose, the less likely it is to happen. At the end of a trial, let's say it's like we are testing placebo versus LSD. And then we are asking you, the patient, to take a guess. Hey, what do you think you got, placebo or LSD? And if you're just guessing randomly, then the patient should get it right about 50% of the time. With psychedelic trials, with the large doses, it's somewhere around 90 to 95% of the time patients get it right. So the correct guess rate, it's not 50%, it's 95%, which means that out of 100 patients, 95 correctly knew what they are getting. With microdosing, like depending on the dose, it's kind of like in the lower 70% range. And with traditional antidepressants, it's about 60%.
And that would mean that if we were just gonna do like stick our head in the sand and continue to ignore the fact that there was this functional unblinding, which means that the placebo thing is kind of like just like almost this thread hanging on to the research trial that is flailing around and not really doing anything, it would mean that we would become more certain about the fact that psychedelics worked better than placebo, because you wouldn't have a strong enough placebo, you wouldn't have strong enough data around the placebo because, you know, people know whether they did or didn't get the psychedelic. Is that kind of, am I understanding that correctly?
It just defeats the purpose of doing placebo-controlled studies, because then, you know, if you know that what you're getting, then of course, like, you know, like people will know that. So when this issue put on the map, and actually one of my earlier studies on microdosing, I think that was one of the papers that started to talk about it, and in the context of microdosing. And at that time, everybody was thinking that if you know that you have taken the psychedelics, then that's going to activate like positive expectation effects. Like, you know, next time you're going to a cocktail party, you're going to be that interesting person that, like, you know, I've been in a psychedelic trial and, you know, it's like cool and jazz and whatever, like, you know, and what we thought is that functional blinding is going to have a bias in the treatment arms, that patients are reporting, you know, sort of like more positive effects. But now we actually do know, I would actually not know that's overstating it, but there is a lot of circumstantial evidence, and I think this is interesting, that what is actually happening is that the placebo response is much, much smaller in psychedelic trials than in other kind of mental health interventions. The issue is that the patients who are in the placebo arm, they are disappointed. And I don't
I was going to
work with
say that
patients.
before.
Yeah, I'm a data scientist. Like, I don't treat patients, but when I talk to the therapists in our team, like, they often say that, like, you know, patients express disappointment and sometimes even frustration when they know that, you know, they've been, you know, kind of screwed over, but, like, you know, like, nobody is signing up for a trial wanting to be in the placebo arm, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, that is
so interesting.
nobody.
I was literally going to say that before. I was like, I don't know if this is appropriate, but if I was in a clinical trial, I would be pissed off that I got a placebo. And then if I had the knowledge that you had about how, you know, this potentially this like placebo controlled double blind study is not the best way to do the science, then I would be even more annoyed that I'd been strung along like this, like, you know, arm of the research effort that didn't really even, you know, like need to be there.
It reminds me, it happened with one of my friends who visited Portugal and wanted to buy some weed, and it turned out that he spent 40 euros on a gram of, I believe it was oregano, or, like, you know, just some sort of, like, you know, like green stuff, like, you know, it was like fake weed. You know, it feels a little bit like that, like, you know, you sign up for these trials, and, you know, participating in these trials it's a lot of effort. Like, you need to come into the clinic a number of times, do all of the questionnaires, yada, yada, yada. Like, it's not, like, it takes effort. That's the point that I want to make. The best example of this is actually coming from ketamine. I think this is worth going through because it's just, like, really, really cool. So ketamine, it's also psychoactive, just like psychedelics. So if you're testing it against an inactive placebo, then this functional unblinding is a big issue for the same reasons as with psychedelics. It's a strongly psychoactive drug. It's easy to distinguish it from placebo. That if you're using a drug called midazolam, which is another anesthetic, as your control condition, then you can actually run studies that functional blinding is much less of an issue. It's still not perfect, but you have significantly decreased how different midazolam feels relative to ketamine compared to, like, ketamine versus placebo. So I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but it is not far from reality that if you're testing ketamine against an inactive placebo, then there is functional blinding. If you're testing ketamine against midazolam, there is no functional blinding. If you're looking at the trials that use midazolam, this active drug, as a placebo control condition, then the placebo response, it's looking normal. So the difference in a blinded study and in a functionally unblinded study, it's not in the treatment arms of these studies. It is in the control arm. And this is something where I spend a lot of my time now, like, trying to gather, like, evidence for it, and, like, how general is this phenomena. But it seems to be that this whole issue of functional unblinding, patients figuring out which group they belong to, it does not biases the treatment arms. So to give you a specific example, with traditional antidepressants, I told you that the placebo response is about 8 points on this Hamilton depression scale, and the treatment response is about 10 to 11 points. So the specific treatment effect, this treatment versus control difference, it's 2 to 3 points.
Mm-hmm. Well, can you for people that aren't used to like the point scale that you're referring to, like what would be a layman's way to understand that?
So like one way is like, for example, if I'm asking you that, like, how well have you slept in the past month? Then like, that 2 point is sort of like going from neutral to sleeping very good. Like typically these are measured on something that's called the Likert scale. The 2 points difference is actually not that big of an effect. I told you that like regulators care about the placebo controlled trials. And for example, the FDA is approving a new drug. They're looking purely at this treatment versus control difference. That's an oversimplification. That's not entirely true, but for the purposes of a podcast, I stand by this statement. They are looking at like how much better is treatment relative to control. And if you're looking up the literature, this is what most trials are reporting as well. Like this is the whole biomedical literature is focusing on this metric. How much better is your drug relative to placebo? When psychedelic studies started to come out, then people have noticed that this specific treatment effect, so this treatment versus control difference, is 6 to 7 points on the aforementioned Hamilton depression scale. And again, it was 2 to 3 points with traditional antidepressants. And this is why psychedelics have generated so much hype that, hey, look, the specific treatment effect is 2 to 3 times larger than with psychedelics. Therefore, these are much better drugs. With psychedelic drugs, I told you that the placebo response is about half of with traditional antidepressants. It's about 4 points on the Hamilton depression scale. The specific treatment effect is 6 to 7 points, but that means that the patient improvement is just the sum of these two. It's about 10 to 11 points. Again, that is exactly the same as with traditional antidepressants. The treatment response, how much patients doing better in the treatment arm, that is about the same. It's just that this treatment versus control difference is much larger with psychedelics, but that's not because patients are doing much better in the treatment arms. It's just because patients are doing much less well in the placebo control condition of psychedelics.
So then what about if people were going to take like some of this science and then just go do what they've already been doing, which is like going to their local drug dealer and buying a couple of grams of mushrooms and being like, well, the science like says that it works, so I'll just do it by myself. I know that's dangerous, especially if we're getting into those bigger doses, but like, I just think, that's what people are going to do.
Oh yeah, it's happening. And like, what you're referring to is called like, the naturalistic use. And there's definitely like, some research in it. And I think, that is kind of like then there's a very wide spectrum of like how people are doing it. Like I'm a big proponent of it that if you are like, with a few good friends and I don't know, you go to like a nice weekend house in the middle of the forest and then, like doing some mushrooms or whatever, that's probably going to have mental health benefits. Like, laughing 6 hours with your friends, that's probably pretty good medication.
Big
Like,
time.
I have no issue with that. But it's very different, especially if you're like a new user and let's say you go to a festival or a concert, like, big crowd, and then you lose your friends and like, suddenly you find yourself alone. That's where like, things can go wrong and, you can get to a dark place quickly.
Yeah, but I think that like you're saying that your job as a data scientist is to bring down the hype, and the media is like really, really hyping up psychotherapy assisted or psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. It's like being really, really hyped up at the moment. And that's probably what people are going to do, is they're going to think that they can just take these substances wherever and it's going to have a benefit. And if they end up at a festival, like, yeah, I've been there. It's not good to be in the wrong set and setting when you're on psychedelics and you're not in a good place.
Yeah, and I think, what's important here is that like, there's this emphasis of kind of like the integration of the psychedelic experience. And I don't know, I don't like the word integration, but I don't have a better one. But like, kind of like the point is that like, often psychedelics, like, you kind of like see a path forward in your life, like, or like you realize that like, what is like one issue that you need to fix, like, maybe, hey, like, and you need to fix that relationship with your mom, or like, call up that old friend and like, work things out. But then you still need to do it. Like I have seen it so
Yeah.
many times in sort of like, my circle of friends that like, you go to this psychedelic experience and then the following day you're very motivated to follow that like, that vision that you had. But then you go back home and then like, Monday, 11 a.m., you still have that meeting with the boss who don't like and just get back like, to the same old patterns. And I kind of feel like, that the psychedelic therapy container, like, the medical use, because it's kind of like serious and you need to like set aside time for it, that provides this extra motivation to follow through, like, what you have been experiencing or what is that vision for your life that you have done. I think like in recreational context, like, that's what gets like lost easier is just like, the follow-up. And I think, this is where like the role of therapy comes in, that like, if you are meeting with somebody, that creates a sense of accountability. And I would say at this
Yeah.
point, we just have to like, for more data to accumulate that how, like, how effective are psychedelics without the therapy component? Like, some of those trials are already happening and they are going to happen. And like, what is the best model for scalability for psychedelics? Because what we do, and I work at UCSF, and we are running these trials, but like what we do, I don't see that happening in the real life simply because it's just too expensive.
Yeah, I actually read something interesting about Compass that they were trying to patent like they were trying to patent all these like different facets of the psychotherapeutic experience because, and I'm sure that it's very nuanced. The reasons behind them doing that are more complex than I'm able to articulate in this podcast. But yeah, they were trying to patent like parts of the therapeutic interaction with the participant because they're a big company and they have to be seen to have some sort of exclusivity over what they're doing in order to actually get the funding to then scale, like you say. And it's just, it feels like it all gets very messy. And if you're also saying that maybe we've overhyped what psychedelics can actually do, so not only have we overhyped what they can do, but they're kind of inaccessible to a lot of people. And even when they are accessible to a lot of people, potentially the effects are not going to be long lasting if you're not having integration for years and years and years after the fact. Like, what is the better option? Like, what is a better option for treating depression or anxiety, and like what's a better option for doing science?
I think I like the keys is that like, of course, like, depression, it's not a purely biological condition. It's not like, somebody coughed at you on the bus and you got the depression virus. Like, it's not like, that there is a bug in your system. It's a lot of it is adaptation to our personal life circumstances.
Mhm.
Like if you are somebody who is struggling financially, like, a hard time, like, paying the bills and the rent and whatnot, then of course, like, you're going to be probably depressed and anxious. But like, that's a social problem. That's not like a biological or a drug problem. If you think about it, we know that depression and anxiety have much more like these social roots rather than biological roots, but we are treating them as if they would be a biological problem
Mm.
because that way we can avoid the much more inconvenient social questions. A lot of people are struggling, financially and otherwise, but those are much bigger questions. So let's just pretend it's a biological question and give researchers like, some, taxpayer money and then pretend that it's going to solve it.
No, I'm starting to realize I like that you said that. And I'm starting to realize that the role of a good data scientist is to be the kind of like sayer of truth and the kind of, yeah, you said before bringing down the hype, but like it really is just pointing out the blind spots and pointing out where we're pretending that something's going to fix a problem because we don't want to actually look in the face what the problem is.
And like, don't get me wrong, like, with psychedelics, I do feel that like, there are definitely benefits to them. And there are many like life circumstances where like, that altered perception of a problem of your life circumstances can really change it or like, can make it better. But like, to me, it feels like, that is like sometimes that is helpful, sometimes it's not. And actually one more thing that I think at this point it might be good to talk about is that then the distribution of how much patients are improving with various mental health treatments if you're looking at traditional antidepressants, it's kind of like a flat distribution. It's like your typical like bell curve. Like everybody is kind of like improving more or less the same. With psychedelics, it seems to be much more like a bimodal distribution. There's a big batch of people who don't improve much or at all, and there's another batch of people who have improved a lot. With psychedelics, the response is it's a lot more all or nothing, while with traditional antidepressants, it's sort of like everybody improves roughly the same amount. It's a little bit of an oversimplification, but the point that I wanted to make is that, like, there seems to be kind of like this, like, thing that, like, psychedelics, patients who improve, they tend to improve, like a lot, but there are also people who don't improve at all. And again, that is in contrast with traditional antidepressants, where it's much more like kind of like everybody improves some.
Interesting. I want to go back in your life to the beginning of your science career. You studied physics, and I'm guessing, well, actually, I'm not going to guess. I'm going to ask, was the thing about physics that was really interesting to you the math bit? And is that kind of the connection to data science for you now?
Yeah, I've been just always like math as a kid. Like, I was always like really good at it. And then, like, what to study at university, like, you're good at maths, let's do physics. Like, that can take you some places, to be honest. That was it. I just ended up here through, like, a set of life circumstances. But, I'm glad that life took me here overall.
Yeah, it's a fun one. Psychedelic research is a fun
Yeah.
one. I also read that you were really interested in rave culture, and that was kind of why the psychedelic, switching over to psychedelics as an area of research, was interesting to you. And I'm wondering if, like, we connect all those dots, the undergraduate in physics, interest in maths, PhD in computational neuroscience, interest in rave culture and psychedelics. Like, you must have some sort of opinion on the nature of consciousness, like this awareness that we have of our existence that seems quite unique to humans. Do you have any personal theories about, like, how that works, what that actually is, that unique quality?
The way, like, I think a lot of people are thinking about it is kind of like, like hierarchical organizations. Like, if you're somebody who's like a materialistic, a reductionist, like, stuff like the hierarchy, like, goes like, from top to the bottom all the way, like, to the atoms, to quantum fields, yada, yada, yada. And that's where you find that, like, that is like your foundational reality. And then, like, for people who are like much more, let's say, like, team consciousness, who are like looking at consciousness as like more the the primary legs, like, working the other way around. But I'm kind of like, I'm very suspicious of, like, this like hierarchical structure to reality. Like, to me, and I'm like not sure if, like, if I can express it well right now, but it's just like it looks much more kind of like flat. Like, I don't believe that, and, like, it's not, I'm not gonna, like, this is just like what I think, but it's not like I have like a killer argument for it. But I just like deeply suspicious of there would be like, one fundamental theory of reality that just like doesn't seem to be like realistic for me. I think, there is like not like, this like very foundational real reality. I think, we have like just different like, windows into it and different perspectives, but it's not like, that there is like this ultimate reality at the end of the day. And so, like, to me, kind of like this like culture war of like team consciousness versus team physics, like, it just doesn't really work. And again, I think, it is a lot of it is just like trying to fight for that prime spot, like, in our intellectual culture about like, what is real. And frankly, just everybody wants to be the smartest. And, like, if you're somebody who's in team consciousness, then of course, like, you're going to be making that argument. But I often feel like, that people know the answer in their heart of heart, and then they work backwards from there. The reason why I became interested in rave culture, not just interested, but like, really became a fan of it, because, like, rave culture is not just about the parties and about the drugs, but there is a community there. Like, typically you don't go to a rave alone, you go with friends, and then you meet the friends of those friends, and it kind of like creates this sort of like, I like to call it like the mid-size social layer in your life. As I said, like, for most adult people, you have friends, but it tends to be like isolated, and you tend to meet with them one-on-one. When you go to a rave, like, it's often like, it's like 20 people going, because again, like, friends of friends are joining you. And I believe that, like, this is something that a lot of people are craving and missing from their life. This sort of like this, the tribe, where not everybody is your best friend, but you have some connection with everybody. And it also creates this like flow of new people into your life, and especially if you're somebody who's like, looking for a new partner in life, this is also really good because this is how you meet new people. I think most people don't like, once you start working, it's extremely difficult to meet new people. Like, in college, like, you meet with your friends, you go to parties together. It's easy to meet new people. There's a flow of new people into your life, and that's also good for creating friendship, and you find romantic partners. And I think that is lost for most people, like after going to college or starting the PhD. That was my experience, that I lost that, and I miss that because I'm a very, very social person. And when I started to go to raves, I realized that like, that's where I have found it again, that like, this sort of like this like larger social group where I'm not best friends with everybody, but I know a lot of people, and like, I'm genuinely happy to see them, even if like, we meet once or twice a year at a rave. It doesn't mean that it's a superficial connection. It just means that like, we are like raving buddies, but it has created like, this circle, this larger circle that goes beyond my family and my high school friends. And I feel that like, this is kind of like I think this is something that's often get lost, like, discussing psychedelics, that whether you're somebody who's coming through psychedelics through rave culture, or you go to like ayahuasca circles or whatnot, but it's a very social thing. Generally, altering your state of consciousness, taking drugs, it tends to be a social thing. And it's not like
Mm.
people don't smoke weed at home, but typically, you invite your friends over, and or you go to, and then or like, especially like, to the raves, if you're doing some MDMA or something, that you typically do that with other people. So it creates like, these communities, these social circles. And I find that to be the isolation and loneliness. I think, there's the number one social problem. And I think,
Mm.
rave culture, like, creates a way out of that. So that's why I like, became interested in rave culture at that point in my life. Again, when I was just coming out of school, and again getting married, which again, like, decreased the motivation to go out. But I find myself lonely, and raves were the way out of that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I totally agree. I'm a big fan of a festival. I don't know if there's a major difference between a festival and a rave, but like, yeah, I totally agree with that. I guess there is also, nuance to that, and there's nuance to everything. But in my life, at least, like I have had festival friends that were, fun and silly to like bump into when you're out and about and you're socializing and altering your consciousness, and you can have a joke and a laugh with them and stuff. But I do think that some of those relationships do actually end up being superficial, and like it can be a little bit of a trap to get like super involved in those communities and trick yourself into thinking that those are the people that are going to show up when a family member dies, or those are the people that are going to show up when you are having trouble parenting. And like maybe the case is that some of those people do end up being the ones in your life that show up. But I know that there's like, there's the balance that has to be held between your friends, your friends that you party with, and the like level to which you can rely on them for like deep long-term friendship, and the level to which you're just like, I actually, you need to be realistic with the bucket that they fall into.
Yeah, I kind of feel like this is a little bit like scientific ideas, like where you have much more than typically what you have time to work on, and just kind of like have to sort through them a little bit of like, you just got to
Yeah.
know people, and some of them you just like say, hey, this is like how deep it's gonna go, and it's 100% fine. But like, through that process of like meeting new people, you're gonna find a few gems where like, you really feel like that, hey, like this could be like a really meaningful friendship. Same with
Yeah.
scientific ideas. Like, time is a limited resource in all of our lives. So you have to be selective of where you are spending it. That's true for scientific ideas and friendships.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and I do think as well, like on the back on the other side of that is that, the rave culture and the festival culture and the consciousness altering culture can really accelerate the relationships with people that are actually going to stick around. Like that's, my boyfriend and I got together like fairly quickly, and I think that is because he gave me a lift to a festival, and we ended up partying at that festival together for 3 or 4 days. And then after that, we were like, we're in love, and we're still together 3 years later. I have also had that similar experience. And this is maybe why I hold so much nuance in this realm, is like I have also had a similar experience where I've gone to a festival, met a guy, and like partied with them for 3 days, and then been like, we're in love, and a week or 2 weeks or a month later been like, this is what? No, like absolutely. This is not this is not the love of my life. So I think, it's just it's something to keep in mind. And really, like a recurring theme in this conversation has just been that there is so much hype around these substances, and that hype needs to be approached with like a little bit more trepidation, or like a little bit more realism.
And then, one thing that I think it's important, kind of like historical context. So really, for most mental health conditions, we just give SSRIs or SNRIs. And those medications have been around since the second half of the 80s, so for about 40 years. And since then, there hasn't, so ketamine has recently become more popular, and some rTMS treatments are becoming more widely available. But it's been kind of like, there hasn't been a lot of development in this area since. When it comes to like mental health related drug treatments, it's not like there is like 10 to 15 different new classes of drugs, and we are like developing them in parallel and see what is happening. No, this has been an area where there has been a starvation of novelty. So that's why also this is like, sort of like the whole field has jumped onto them, because, there is something, that is new here. And of course, a big part of it is that, with psychedelics, just sort of like a cultural history, there's like something cool and interesting about them. A lot of interesting people have taken them, yada, yada, yada. It adds that element, which is like very unusual for a mental health treatment. When nobody's doing SSRIs recreationally. It's not a cool thing to do, right? Nobody's going to a party and going to take some benzos or,
Well,
so
I think unfortunately that is happening. But that's a whole
that is happening?
other. Yeah, okay. I think it's like that's definitely happening, but that's a problematic thing. You shouldn't be going to parties and taking those kinds of drugs. That's like addiction. We're getting into like addiction territory when we talk about those drugs being taken recreationally.
Yeah, but the point is that there is something kind of like unique about psychedelics that attracts a lot of people here, because they are kind of psychedelic experiences. We're researching their medical value and whatnot, but one thing that's undeniable is that they are interesting. That is at least that you can say about them. And I do feel that, when it goes, going back to hype and whatnot, this is just kind of like the natural progression of new technologies. That there is that curve that I'm sure you have seen, that for most technologies, initially, in the early days, there's a lot of promise, and then hit a peak, and then they are coming down a little bit worse, and then there's sort of this plateau of productivity, things kind of eventually normalize.
Yeah, I wonder if the it's a sign of the times as well as magic mushrooms can they make all these connections, they help with meaningful connections, like you mentioned earlier about how you can do a trip and then the insight is like, oh, I actually need to call my mum and talk to her about this thing, and then that can be what's blocking you in your life. You do that, you take that action, and things kind of solve themselves. It's almost like magic mushrooms are really helpful for any sort of meaning crisis that we have, and we are in the midst of a more we're in the midst of a meaning crisis broadly, in a kind of global meaning crisis. That's why so many people are going back to organized religions, and so psilocybin and psychedelics are kind of like the right medicine for the time. And maybe back in the day, after when things became more industrialized and people were coming back from the wars, the right medications were SSRIs. And I wonder if in 20 years' time, when your daughters are in their 30s, there'll be a different sort of global malaise. And so we'll have to find a different kind of medicine that can be new and interesting and work in conjunction with that actual kind of cultural issue.
And yeah, they're definitely resonant with where we are in culture right now. And who knows where it is going to go, or Here with AI, of course, a lot of people are worried about their jobs because of that. How that meaning crisis is going to look like, where I don't know, 70% of the jobs are lost. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, or I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we are certainly living in a time where things are changing very, very rapidly, and it's just impossible to calculate where it's going to end up, and then what is going to be then the need of the people in response to those circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's kind of what I was getting to, is that psychedelics are powerful for making meaning, or like reorganizing the meaning that you've already made. And like people are having to shift and pivot so fast at the moment because of the rapid evolution of technology, that being able to like make meaning out of things that are uncomfortable in a way that helps you positively move forward seems like a really important thing for people to be able to do at the moment. And maybe like the widespread availability of psilocybin as a medicine, psychedelics more broadly as a medicine, is good for this particular time. But after that's all said and done, and we're all on some weird UBI, or an AI is doing our jobs, and I don't know, like everyone's got a chip in their head, then there'll be some other crisis, and we'll need some other thing to help us with it. And who knows what that will be. Well, Balázs, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really interesting conversation. Where can people find your work if they want to keep up to date with your research, and any talks or lectures that you're putting out there?
So to be honest, I tend to post just on Twitter or X nowadays, and it is Psybalazs, like Psybalazs. I always put the latest out there, like in terms of like scientific work, and also talks and podcasts. That's probably the best place.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, good luck with the next lot of research that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.